The winter of 1886 announced its arrival not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a predatory silence. By late October, the high peaks surrounding the settlement of Providence Creek were already choked with white, and the usual autumn clamor of the wilderness had faded into a low, expectant hum. The squirrels, frantic and fat, had stripped the pines bare. The great flocks of geese that normally lingered until the first true frost had vanished weeks earlier, their southbound flight a hurried, desperate exodus. For the 100 or so souls huddled in the valley, these were subtle omens, easily dismissed as the quirks of a single season. For Alara Vance, they were a death warrant. She was 19 years old. A widow for less than a year, her husband taken by a falling lodgepole pine during the previous winter's thaw. An orphan since the fever of '78, she lived alone in a small, rough-hewn cabin at the northernmost edge of the settlement, a place where the valley floor began its steep climb into the unforgiving teeth of the mountains. Her isolation was both geographic and social. She was seen as a creature of the fringe, too quiet, too observant, her ways not quite aligned with the rigid, God-fearing pragmatism of Providence Creek. Her knowledge was not their knowledge. It was a legacy of whispers and observations, passed down from a grandmother who had learned to read the land not as a resource to be conquered, but as a living entity with moods and intentions. It was this inherited wisdom that now filled Alara with a cold, clear certainty. This would not be a hard winter. It would be a terminal one. The patterns were undeniable, a confluence of signs her grandmother had spoken of only once, in a hushed and fearful tone. The premature flight of the birds, the unnatural thickness of animal pelts, the peculiar brittle quality of the air itself. It was the precursor to a deep, sustained cold that could shatter trees and freeze a man's lungs in his chest. On the 1st of November, with the sky a sheet of hammered pewter and the wind carrying the first sterile scent of Arctic ice, Alara Vance walked the half-mile to the town hall. She carried no ledger and no petition, only a terrible conviction. She had to warn them. She had to try, even though she knew in the marrow of her bones that the men who ran Providence Creek would not listen to a 19-year-old widow who spoke the language of squirrels and geese. The town hall was also the church, a singular, drafty building that smelled of pine boards and piety. The council was assembled for its weekly meeting. Reverend Thaddeus Blackwood, his face a mask of stern benevolence; Jedediah Stone, the owner of the lumber mill and the largest landholder, a man whose pragmatism was measured in board feet and profit; and Silas Croft, the town's master carpenter, a man who believed a well-cut dovetail joint was the pinnacle of human achievement. They were the pillars of the community, their authority as solid and unyielding as the granite mountains that encircled them. They listened to Alara's request to speak with an air of strained indulgence, a brief pause in the serious business of allocating funds for a new church bell. "I have come to speak about the winter," Alara began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She stood before them, a small figure in a worn wool dress, her face pale in the thin light filtering through the tall windows. "The signs are wrong. The animals know what is coming. The birds left a month before their time. The bark on the north side of the aspens is thicker than I have ever seen. My grandmother called this the pattern of the long dark. It will be a winter of unprecedented cold, a freeze that will settle in and not break until spring." She paused, letting her words settle in the quiet room. Jedediah Stone shifted in his chair, a frown creasing his brow. "And what is it you are suggesting, Mrs. Vance? That we pack up our homes and flee south like your geese?" A few of the other men in attendance chuckled. The sound was low and dismissive. "No," Alara said, her gaze unwavering. "I am suggesting that our current preparations are not enough. A double store of firewood will not be sufficient. The chinking in our walls will not hold against the cold that is coming. We need a communal plan. We need to reinforce one of the larger buildings, this one perhaps, insulate it properly, and prepare to house the entire community together when the worst of it arrives. We must pool our resources now, or we will perish individually later. Reverend Blackwood rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow. He clasped his hands behind his back and regarded Alara with a look of profound, paternal disappointment. "My dear child," he began, his voice a sonorous baritone that filled the hall. "While your concern for your neighbors is admirable, your reasoning is based on what amounts to folklore and superstition. We are a people of faith and fortitude. We have faced hard winters before. God tests us, it is true, but he does not abandon his flock to the whims of squirrels and the flight patterns of birds. To indulge in this panic is to show a lack of faith in his providence. It is fear-mongering." Silas Croft, the carpenter, spoke next, his voice rough with indignation. He felt his professional integrity had been challenged. "With all due respect, Reverend, it's also an insult to my craft. The cabins in this valley are built to last. I built most of them myself. Good, solid log construction. They have withstood blizzards and 40-below temperatures. They are not the fragile things this young woman imagines. What she suggests, this communal huddling, it is an admission of failure. My work does not fail." "It is folly," Jedediah Stone concluded, his tone final. "A waste of time and precious resources we need for productive work before the snow flies for good. We will all see to our own homes, as we always have. A little extra wood, a little extra care with the storm shutters. That is the sensible way, the Providence Creek way." He looked directly at Alara, his eyes cold. "Your fear is your own, Mrs. Vance. Do not attempt to spread it like a contagion among us." The dismissal was absolute. The council moved on to the matter of the church bell, the scrape of their chairs on the wooden floor a definitive end to the conversation. Alara stood there for a moment, invisible, her warning dissolving into the air like a puff of frozen breath. She saw the faces of the other townspeople, the way they avoided her eyes, the slight smirks on the faces of the younger men. She was the hysterical widow, the foolish girl who saw doom in a caterpillar's stripes. She had known they would not listen, but the reality of their condescension was a physical weight. She turned and walked out of the hall, the door closing behind her with a soft, final click. The valley was on its own, and so was she. Her own cabin was a testament to the very problem she had described. Built by her husband's grandfather, it was a standard, single-wall log structure, 18 feet wide and 22 feet long. It was drafty, poorly insulated, and difficult to heat even in a mild winter. Her husband, Daniel, had always meant to rebuild it, but there was never enough time or money. Now, it was her problem to solve. If the community would not build a sanctuary, she would have to build her own. The idea had been forming in her mind for weeks, a radical solution born from her grandmother's teachings on the principles of survival. It was a concept so simple and yet so alien to the construction methods of men like Silas Croft. She would not fight the cold. She would trap it. She would build a second, smaller cabin entirely inside the first, creating a protective layer of motionless air, a dead air gap, between her living space and the lethal winter outside. On November 2nd, 1886, Alara Vance began her work. Her resources were meager. Daniel had left behind his logging tools, a good felling axe, a broadaxe, an adze, a bucksaw, and an auger, and a small coffee can containing their life savings. She counted it carefully on her small wooden table. $47 in silver coins. It was a fortune and, at the same time, pitifully inadequate for the task she envisioned. She drew a careful plan on a piece of birch bark with a lump of charcoal, calculating dimensions and materials with painstaking precision. The existing cabin's interior was her building site. The inner cabin, her winter core, would be 10 feet wide and 12 feet long, with a 7-foot ceiling. This would leave a buffer zone, the critical dead air gap, of 4 feet on the 2 long sides, 5 feet on the 2 short sides, and a significant attic space above. Her first task was to fortify the outer shell. The main cabin had to become a rudimentary but effective barrier against the primary assault of the wind and driven snow. For a week, she worked from dawn until dusk on the exterior. She bought 2 large buckets of lime and a sack of salt from the general store for 60 cents, mixing it with clay, sand, and water to create a durable daubing. Methodically, she worked her way around the cabin, forcing the mixture deep into every crack and seam between the logs where the old chinking had crumbled away. It was grueling, repetitive work. Her hands became raw, the cold autumn air biting at her exposed skin. Jedediah Stone rode by on his horse one afternoon, pausing to watch her. He did not offer help, only a condescending piece of advice. "You'd be better served spending your time cutting wood, Mrs. Vance. A bigger fire is the only answer to a cold winter." Ilara merely nodded and continued her work, pressing the cold, wet daubing into a gaping seam near the foundation. Next, she turned her attention to the materials for the inner cabin. She could not afford to buy milled lumber from Stone's mill for the entire structure. The $47 had to be stretched to its absolute limit. On the far edge of her property stood the skeletal remains of an old shepherd's hut, collapsed years ago. The logs were rotten, but the roof timbers, made of seasoned fir, were mostly sound. For another week, she labored with the bucksaw and axe, salvaging every usable piece of wood. She dragged the heavy beams back to her cabin one by one, her muscles aching with a deep, unfamiliar burn. The salvaged wood was rough and uneven, but it was strong. It would form the bones of her sanctuary. With her small cache of silver, she made a single, crucial trip to the general store. She spent $27 on the most important component, a small, modern cast-iron stove, a model known for its efficiency and miserly consumption of wood. It was an enormous expense, more than half her savings, but it was the heart of her system. She also purchased a box of nails, 10 lengths of stovepipe, 2 precious panes of glass for a small window, and a roll of thick tar paper. The remaining $20 she kept for absolute emergencies. The storekeeper, a man named Harris, looked at her purchases with pity. "That's a mighty small stove for a cabin this size, Ilara," he'd said, shaking his head. "It won't throw enough heat to keep a cat warm in a real blow." She did not bother to explain that it was not intended to heat the whole cabin, only a small, insulated box within it. The construction of the inner cabin began on November 15th. The weather had grown colder, and the first light snows dusted the valley floor each morning. She laid down heavy salvaged beams as foundation sills, raising the floor of her winter core a full foot off the main cabin's cold, drafty floorboards. Upon this, she built a sturdy floor of thick, hand-hewn planks, leaving no gaps. Then, she began to erect the frame. It was a simple post and beam design, the uprights mortised into the sills and top plates. The work was slow and deliberate. She had to hoist the heavy beams into place herself, using a simple rope and lever system she devised. More than once, a heavy timber slipped, crashing to the floor just inches from her feet. Each evening, she collapsed onto her cot, exhausted, but driven by the clear and present image of the coming cold. The walls were her primary innovation, the element that deviated most sharply from conventional wisdom. They were not solid wood. Instead, she built 2 parallel frames for each wall, creating a 6-inch cavity between the inner and outer surfaces. This was the most time-consuming part of the entire project. She sheathed the exterior of the frame with the salvaged planks, and the interior with thinner boards she painstakingly split from the remaining logs. Then, she began to fill the void. This was where her grandmother's knowledge of natural insulators came into play. For days, she gathered her materials. She filled sacks with dry, fluffy moss from the shaded sides of boulders in the forest. She waded into the icy marsh at the edge of the creek to harvest cattail heads, their downy fluff a remarkably effective insulator. She even went to Jedediah Stone's mill and shoveled sawdust, a worthless byproduct to him, into barrels, which he allowed her to take for free, amused by her strange project. Back in her cabin, she meticulously packed the wall cavities with a dense, layered mixture of these materials. First, a layer of sawdust, then a thick batting of moss, then a layer of cattail fluff, packed tightly to eliminate any air pockets. She even sacrificed 2 old, threadbare wool blankets, shredding them and adding the wool to the mixture. Silas Croft stopped by one day, ostensibly to check on the widow's welfare, but more likely drawn by gossip of her bizarre undertaking. He peered into the half-finished structure, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Good Lord, woman, what is this?" he asked, poking a finger at the exposed insulation in a wall cavity. "You're building a mouse nest, not a house. This will all settle, rot, and draw vermin. You need solid wood. Wood holds the heat. Everyone knows that." "Solid wood also bleeds heat, Mr. Croft," Alara replied calmly, not pausing in her work of stuffing wool into a corner. "This will not bleed heat. The air trapped in these fibers will hold it. It is the principle of a bird's feathers or a fox's fur." Croft scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "You are not a fox, Mrs. Vance, and this is not a den. This is a fire trap and a tomb. You will suffocate in this box. A house needs to breathe." He shook his head and left, striding back toward the town, no doubt with a fresh story of the widow's madness to share with the men at the general store. His words, meant to sting, did not touch her. She knew what she was doing. The principles of thermodynamics were not subject to a carpenter's opinion. The roof of the inner cabin was constructed with the same care, with a foot-deep cavity packed with the same insulating blend. She installed the small cast-iron stove in a corner, its base resting on a carefully constructed hearth of flat stones and clay. The stovepipe was the most dangerous and complex part of the system. It rose vertically, passed through a wide, fire-proofed collar in the inner ceiling, and then ran at an angle across the cold attic of the dead air gap before exiting through the main cabin's roof. She spent 2 full days on this junction, encasing the pipe in a thick sleeve of packed clay and surrounding it with stones where it passed through the outer roof, ensuring no stray spark could ever ignite the dry timber. Finally, she installed the 2 small, double-paned windows she had crafted, sealing them against any possible draft. The inner pane was one of the 2 she had purchased. The outer pane was salvaged from the old shepherd's hut, creating yet another small dead air gap. By the 2nd week of December, it was finished. Her winter core stood as a small, sturdy house within a house. The interior was cozy and womb-like, smelling of dry moss and clean sawn wood. The space between the 2 structures, the dead air gap, had become a vast, sheltered storage area. She moved her entire winter's supply of firewood into this space, stacking it neatly against the inner walls. Her preserved foods, jars of beans, smoked fish, dried berries, were arranged on shelves. Barrels of water, drawn from the creek before it froze solid, stood in a row. The main cabin's large, inefficient stone fireplace now stood cold and unused in the buffer zone. Her old cot and furniture were now arranged in the tiny 10 by 12-foot inner room. The first true test came on December 18, 1876. The day dawned still and unnaturally clear. The temperature at sunrise was already 20 degrees below zero. There was no wind, only a profound, crystalline cold that seemed to suck the very sound from the air. Alara knew it was the calm before the storm. She lit a small fire in her new stove, using only a few pieces of split pine. Within an hour, the temperature inside her winter core had risen to a comfortable 65 degrees. She placed a kettle on the stove and sat listening to the silence. Around noon, the sky to the north began to darken, not with the gray of a snowstorm, but with a bruised, purple-black malevolence. The wind arrived first as a low moan, a whisper that grew steadily into a piercing shriek. Then, the snow came, not as flakes, but as a horizontal torrent of fine, sharp ice crystals. The blizzard had arrived. For 4 days, the world outside ceased to exist. It was a maelstrom of sound and fury. The wind hammered at the outer walls of her cabin, a relentless, physical assault. She could hear the shriek of it through the logs, a sound that would have terrified her in the past. But inside her winter core, it was remarkably quiet. The 4-foot buffer of air and the insulated inner walls dampened the storm's rage to a distant roar. Snow piled up against the main cabin, burying it completely on the north side. But this too was part of the design. The snow itself was an insulator. She monitored the temperatures carefully. Outside, according to the spirit thermometer nailed to the outer wall, the mercury dropped to 30 below, then 40, then an almost unbelievable 52 degrees below zero. The wind chill would have been incomprehensible. Inside the dead air gap, the unheated space between her cabins, the temperature hovered at a steady 20 degrees above zero, a 72-degree difference from the outside. And inside her tiny, warm room, with a minuscule fire sipping fuel in the cast-iron stove, it remained a steady, comfortable 65 degrees. She used less firewood in a day than her husband used to burn in 2 hours, just to keep the old cabin from freezing. Her system was not just working, it was working perfectly. She was safe, she was warm, she was alone. Meanwhile, in Providence Creek, a different reality was unfolding. The conventional wisdom of the town's founders was being systematically dismantled by the laws of physics. The sturdy, breathing cabins that Silas Croft had built with such pride were death traps. The Arctic wind, driven by hurricane-force gusts, exploited every tiny crack, every seam in the chinking, every gap around a window frame. It forced the cold air in and sucked the warm air out with ruthless efficiency. Families huddled around their roaring fireplaces, burning through their winter wood supply at a terrifying rate. They stuffed rags and clothes into the cracks, but it was like trying to dam a river with a handful of sand. Jedediah Stone's large, handsome 2-story house, the grandest in the valley, became his prison. The sheer volume of the space was impossible to heat. While the downstairs great room was kept barely above freezing by a massive, gluttonous fire, the upstairs bedrooms were as cold as the outdoors. His family was forced to abandon the second floor entirely, huddling together in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The fine glass in his windows, a mark of his wealth, was a sieve for heat, frosting over with a thick, opaque layer of ice on the inside. Reverend Blackwood's faith was being subjected to a brutal test. He led prayers in the church, but the cavernous building was colder than a tomb. The great, beautiful windows he had been so proud of were sheets of ice. The congregation dwindled to only the most desperate, their prayers lost in the howl of the wind that rattled the very foundations of the Holy House. His sermons on fortitude and God's providence sounded hollow and cruel in the face of such a relentless, impersonal adversary. Hardship, it turned out, was not a noble test when it was freezing your children. Not one of them had lost a family member in the first few days, but the signs of collapse were everywhere. Not one had burned through less than half their winter wood supply in under a week. Not one had a room in their house that was truly warm, and not one, in their shivering misery, would yet admit they had been wrong. They were a proud, stubborn people, and they would sooner freeze to death in their own homes than admit that the strange, solitary widow on the edge of town had been right. On the fifth day, December 23rd, the wind abated for a few hours. The silence that fell was as shocking as the previous noise. It was in this brief, fragile lull that the first crack in the town's resolve appeared. It came in the form of a desperate, frantic pounding on the outer door of Alara's cabin. She was in her inner room, reading by the light of a tallow lamp. The sound was so unexpected it made her jump. She pulled on a heavy coat and boots, opened the inner door, and walked through the cool but calm air of the buffer zone to the main entrance. She slid back the heavy bolt. The door, swollen with ice, took all her strength to pull open. Standing on her porch, covered in a shroud of snow and ice, was Silas Croft. The master carpenter's face was a mask of gray despair, his proud beard frozen into a solid, crystalline mass. His eyes, when they met hers, held no condescension, only a raw, animal terror. "Help us," he rasped, his voice cracking. "Please. My wife, Mary, she's taken ill. The fever. Our cabin. It's colder inside than out. We have no more wood. We burned everything. The chairs, the table. It's all gone. We will die tonight." Behind him, stumbling through the deep snow, was another figure. It was Jedediah Stone. The wealthiest man in the valley was a pathetic sight, his expensive wool coat inadequate against the savage cold, his face gaunt and frostbitten at the ears and nose. He did not speak, but his eyes pleaded. And behind him, a third man, his tall frame bent against the cold, his face hidden by a scarf. It was the Reverend Thaddeus Blackwood. Alara looked at the three men who had publicly mocked her, who had dismissed her warning as the hysterical fantasy of a foolish girl. She saw in their faces the complete and utter collapse of their world, the shattering of their certainties. There was no triumph in her heart, no satisfaction in their humbling. There was only a profound and weary sadness. "Bring your families," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the returning moan of the wind. "Bring anyone who can make the journey. The children and the sick will stay in the inner room. The rest can shelter in the space between. It is not warm, but it is out of the wind. Hurry, the storm is not over." They did not need to be told twice. The word spread through the frozen settlement like a desperate prayer. Within an hour, a ragged procession was struggling through the snowdrifts towards Alara's cabin. It was a vision from a nightmare. Parents carried children wrapped in blankets, their faces pinched and blue with cold. The old and the weak were supported by the stronger, every step an agony. Alara stood at her door, a beacon in the frozen wasteland, directing the river of human misery into the sanctuary she had built. She organized the space with calm efficiency. The small 10 by 12-foot inner cabin became an infirmary and nursery. The 9 sickest townspeople, including Silas Croft's wife, and all 12 children under the age of 10 were brought into the life-giving warmth. They lay on pallets on the floor, so close together they were touching, but they were warm for the first time in days. The small stove glowed with a steady, reassuring heat. The remaining 34 survivors, including Stone, Croft, and Reverend Blackwood, were housed in the dead air gap. It was cold, the temperature holding at a brisk 20 degrees, but it was a paradise compared to the lethal, wind-blasted hell they had just escaped. They were sheltered. The screaming of the wind was a muted roar. They huddled together for warmth on the floor of the outer cabin, surrounded by Alara's neatly stacked cords of firewood and her stores of food. For 7 more days, the great blizzard raged. The world was reduced to the confines of Alara Vance's dual-walled cabin. She became the unquestioned leader, the quiet center of the storm. She rationed her food, making a thin but hot soup from dried beans and smoked fish, ensuring the children and the sick were fed first. She tended to the ill, using her grandmother's knowledge of herbal remedies to brew teas for fever and poultices for frostbite. She spoke little, but her presence was a constant, calming force. The men who had scorned her now looked upon her with a kind of awe. They watched her tend the small, efficient stove that was the heart of their survival. They saw the genius in the sawdust and moss-filled walls they had mocked. They felt the stillness of the air in the buffer zone and finally understood the principle they had dismissed as folly. In the crucible of the deep freeze, their arrogance had been burned away, leaving only a raw and humbling gratitude. Jedediah Stone, the mill owner, found himself chopping wood from her vast supply to feed the stove, his hands clumsy and unused to the simple labor. Silas Croft, the master carpenter, spent his time examining the joinery of the inner cabin, his face a mixture of wonder and professional shame. Reverend Blackwood led quiet prayers, no longer speaking of God's tests, but of his mercy, delivered through the hands of the woman they had cast out. When the storm finally broke on the morning of December 30th, the silence was absolute. The sun rose in a sky of painful, brilliant blue, illuminating a world transformed. The valley was buried under 15 feet of snow, a landscape of sweeping, sculpted drifts that had erased all roads and landmarks. From the single chimney of Alara's cabin, a thin plume of smoke rose, the only sign of life in the entire valley. When the survivors emerged, blinking into the bright, frozen world, the true cost of their foolishness became apparent. 18 people had not made it to Alara's sanctuary. 4 entire families, those who lived furthest away or were too proud or too weak to make the journey, had perished in their perfectly built, single-walled cabins. Their homes were silent, snow-shrouded tombs. The vindication of Alara Vance was total, but it was a somber, silent thing. There were no celebrations, no triumphant declarations. There was only the grim work of survival and the heavy weight of loss. The men of the council, led by a deeply humbled Jedediah Stone, formally apologized to her, their words heavy with the ghosts of those who had died. They asked for her guidance, for her knowledge. In the months that followed, as the long, slow thaw of spring began, the settlement of Providence Creek was rebuilt. But it was rebuilt along new principles. The Vance Winter Core, as it came to be known, became the standard for all new construction. Existing cabins were retrofitted, with smaller, insulated rooms built inside them. The forgotten wisdom of an old woman, passed down to her granddaughter, had become the new gospel of survival. Alara Vance was no longer the outcast, the strange widow on the edge of town. She was their sage, their savior. They looked to her for answers, not just about building, but about reading the land and living in harmony with its brutal power, rather than in opposition to it. Yet she took no joy in her new status. She could not look at the new, improved cabins without thinking of the ones that stood empty, without seeing the faces of the children who had not survived. Her knowledge had been proven correct, but the price of that proof had been 18 lives. She had been right, but she would have given anything to have been wrong. The deep freeze had passed, but a different kind of cold, the cold of memory and loss, had settled in her heart to stay.